understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter.
Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Dillon. I have a Master of Divinity, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
I'm Sam. I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics. You want to say what the word is for today?
Today, the word is fact versus truth.
Well, the word is just truth. We're going to name this episode just truth, but we got to talk about fact to unpack this word truth. How do you feel about when someone says truth in relationship to Christianity? I know the truth. They need to know truth. How do you feel about that phrase?
Well, I would ask, what truth? What truth? Is there only one truth? Is there many truths?
Yeah.
Capital T truth versus like lowercase t truth.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what truth is.
I mean, I have my own personal.
Well, I am asking personal. I know you don't. You don't like to get personal. You hate to get personal. I like dive into it. I have no problem with it.
Well, I think there is only, for me personally, I think there is only one truth. I think there is only one truth, and that truth comes from the divine, from God. So I think there's one truth, but how you get to that one truth, which is ultimately, for me, the goodness, mercy, and love of God, whose grace we receive, that there is only one truth, and yet there is many different, many different ways, many different paths, many different journeys.
That's so good. So good. Okay, so hang in there with us, everybody.
Can I just do one more thing? There is one moon and one sun. I'm talking about Earth that we can observe and see. Obviously, there's other moons. There's other things on other planets. That's not. I'm not obviously negating that, or I realize that. But we have one moon and one sun, to which we can again observe from this planet Earth to which we live, and but there are many different ways and at many different times that each of us see and observe that sun and that moon. We might be seeing the moon at one point, and then hours and hours later, someone is So
you are really touching on something here. So we're going to start kind of philosophical, but I promise, hang in there because we're going to really ground it. So, hold on.
But the truth is, I know you're itching here. But the truth is, there's one moon and there's one sun. We're not arguing are there different suns or moon. We're not even arguing the path. We're just saying there's different paths to the one true thing, which is for me.
Your use of the word true
God.
is really interesting. We're going to talk about it, but first, if you ever go to graduate school or when I got my doctorate, you talk a lot about this thing called epistemology. Did you do that in your MDiv?
We did.
Well, whenever you get your doctorate, when I got my doctorate, they make you choose. They make you like situate yourself in this. Epistemology is just a very fancy scientific way to say, what is knowledge? How do we know things to be true or factual? And I am a constructivist, which means I believe knowledge is constructed by groups, because what we thought was true about the world 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago, last week is different from today because we continually construct this as a community. We construct what we believe to be true about this reality, and it's always shifting and changing. So what we think is knowledge, I believe, is constructed. So I'm a constructivist. All of this is a highfalutin way to say that truth and fact have a lot to do with how we think about knowledge and this reality. So I always want to start with the language. So truth and fact historically are not the same words. We treat them as synonyms now, like that's true. oftentimes we're saying that's factual, but that's not how it's always been. So fact comes from the Latin word, and I know I'm going to butcher a lot of these Latin and Greek words, but fact comes from the Latin word facere, which means to make. So fact implies that what we deem factual is actually made into reality rather than inherent, right? We used to believe that it was factual that the earth was flat, right? That was a fact. So we made that knowledge, we brought it into reality, we constructed it, right? So back to this constructivist thing. Human beings decide what is factual through our own process of knowledge creation and consensus. And we're going to talk about some of those processes later. And this is all related to Christianity, so hang in there. For example, the scientific method, this is a process that helps us decide, right? Because it's not always inherent. Science has been wrong a lot. So the scientific method, it must be applied to the same concept over and over again until the scientific community will determine something to be fact. If you're really, if you like to nerd out like Dillon and I, if you read things in the scientific world, I do social science. Dillon does a lot of theology. Is theology a social science? It's kind of its own thing, right? Like the study of divinity.
It's usually housed under philosophy.
Yes. Well, so social.
Well, so yeah,
social
I mean, if you look at it like that,
linguistics is
sure.
a philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So I have so much to say, and I do have an outline here, so I'm going to try to stick to it. So the scientific process, of course, is not without flaw. There's countless things that science once deemed fact that later was not. For example, science used biology to point to Africans and their muscle mass and their skull sizes to support the absolutely dehumanizing and abusive belief that Africans were built for manual labor and not intellectual labor. This was science, by the way, that influenced the belief that black bodies should be enslaved by white bodies, right? Science backed that up. Of course,
well, specifics.
We do not believe that now, I would hope. Go ahead.
Well, right, and specific science had backed that up. Science that was only being done by white people.
Right. Sometimes people think science is super objective. It is not. Science studies white male bodies, so it's not true across the board, right? So let's just get into truth then. Truth is something different from fact historically. We hear people saying things, especially related to religion, about them knowing the truth. But this word truth has not always been about believing or knowing the correct thing. Truth has not always been a synonym for fact. The word connected to truth in Old English is triuth. I'm not even sure I'm saying that right, but I struggle with Old English words. It's very King James, you know. But
good old King James.
This word truth in Old English, and even before that, it means faithfulness and commitment to something. So it's not about what is being believed in, but rather the process of believing itself. So to make this make more sense, truth is related to the word troth, which refers to loyalty, and is often used in the context of marriage and engagement as in to be betrothed to someone, right? Even a knight. A knight might be described as true or having truth, a true knight, right? That doesn't mean they're factual. It means they're committed. They are loyal to something. A knight might also be called false. It didn't mean that they lacked factuality. It means they lacked honor, loyalty, and commitment to what they made an oath to. Do you have something to say?
Well, yeah. Truth also when someone says like, I know the truth. Even that phrasing, I know the truth. That is putting the truth in a kind of scientific understanding that you know mentally or know through knowledge of the mind or the brain that something is true, and that might very well be true. Okay,
but it's one perspective.
But truth, when one talks about truth, there's this fairly well, I don't, not maybe to everybody, but to people that study philosophy and theology and biblical studies, the name Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was an late 18th century, early 19th century German theologian in the Lutheran and Reformed tradition, talked about truth and the word truth and the process of truth is that which you are feeling. So when you say that something is true, it's something that you can experience through your feeling, which also would point to the same thing. When you fall in love with someone, you can't explain that fully scientifically, but what you can do is you can feel it. You can feel it in your body.
Dylan and I have talked this to death, but what you're saying kind of matches my entire outline.
Okay, so what? Yeah, so all I would say is when you say that I have a better phrase, at least that I think, is not saying I know the truth. Okay, sure, you probably do know the truth, but I have experienced the truth.
Yeah.
I have felt the truth.
Yeah.
I know that sounds odd to us, especially in English, but what the truth is an experience of feeling both your connection to the divine, your connection to God, but also your connection to your neighbor or someone who you're close to who also has a piece of the divine in them. So,
and it's not just about the brain. We're going to talk a lot more about that.
Yeah, so truth is more about
a commitment to something.
A feeling, a commitment, a deep connection.
A posture towards something.
Yeah, and Friedrich Schleiermacher talked about that in that faith and truth is about the feeling one experiences with God.
Right. So to be true or to have truth meant to be loyal and to pledge a certain allegiance or commitment to a spouse, right? When you're betrothed to someone, to God, or to a nation if you're a knight and you're true, right? If someone says you're true, it doesn't mean that you're factual. It means that you have commitment. You haven't made an allegiance. You've made an oath with something. So in Christianity, to say that Christianity is true, I want to acknowledge something very quickly. There's something in linguistics, which is the study of language. There's a fallacy to believe that what a word used to mean is what it has to mean all the time in all contexts. That's wrong.
That's hogwash.
So I don't want to try to portray it that way, but it is important to look to the past at what these words mean to kind of give us some wisdom for how we use it now. So it doesn't mean if I say like, that's true. Now we've equated, and we're going to talk about how we got here, but we've equated truth with fact. But a lot of times throughout most of Christian history, that has not been the case. That's a very new development. Truth meaning something factual.
Yes, and I also want to add one thing before we go on to the Enlightenment. You will see these motifs of truth in betrothal and like marriage relationships, and again going back to this kind of relational connection, this deep feeling between two people or a group or God. It's
relational, not rational.
Right, and so it's this experience and this feeling of truth that we get to experience in the life of faith, which is interesting because in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, some of these have become problematic in some ways, but there is a lot of passages in the Hebrew scriptures in the New Testament that talk about the relationship between humanity and the divine God in marital relations. So Christ and Christ's bride, the bridegroom, and obviously we're dealing with ancient texts here, so we're dealing with kind of some heteronormativity here, but this idea, but even it's so interesting because if you're looking at Jesus Christ, not to get in the weeds here, but if you're looking at Jesus Christ as the historic male that he was, but then you're looking at Jesus Christ's connection to humanity, that's including people of all genders and all sexual orientations and all this, and they're talking about a marriage between each other, a relationship, a feeling, an experience, a truth that people experience. So even that whole thing, the language might be problematic, but actually the truth that it's speaking to is actually deeply inclusive. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What we're really trying to say here is that truth, this word truth, has more to do with loyalty and commitment, and it's very relational and it's experienced, and fact is something that can be proven. Religion and faith and all these things can't be proven. It's experienced and related to. So even in the Bible, the Hebrew word that often gets translated as truth in the Old Testament, it's emeth. I think I'm saying that right, which relates to trustworthiness. Again, so you're seeing this like trust like relational words like trust, right?
Which
you
is
trust
also
somebody.
a feeling.
Yeah.
You know when you trust somebody, you know when you don't.
Right. Right. People get downright metaphysical, and whenever, like, have you ever heard, like, a real rational person be like, I just don't trust them. Okay, why? I don't know, I just don't. Where it's like, yeah, because you're acknowledging that there are ways of knowing that go beyond language, beyond science, and beyond our brains. There are other ways of knowing, which we're going to talk about. But let's talk about truth in the context of Christianity. For most of Christian history, truth meant to be committed to someone or something, not to possess correct knowledge. So truth could not be proven or argued. It was embodied, right? I know we're kind of repeating ourselves, but it's important. It was embodied in your character and loyalties. People were and are committed to the Christian way or the way of Jesus. This was to be truthful. Not because they can prove anything about this way, but just because somehow they know deep in their bones that this story about this nonviolent resistance of Jesus is true to us. We somehow know that this way of war and anger and violence that our world is built on, that's not true. It's not what we're here to be like. You know what I mean? And we know that. We can't intellectualize it. I don't have statistics for you. All I know is I know it. I know it. It is true. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And just because it cannot be the modern science, we have talked about this in other episodes too, but modern science is obsessed with materialism.
Yeah.
If you can't, touch it, see it, test it, yada yada,
Measure it.
then it's not real. Well,
Right.
That is just absolute hogwash, because I'm really liking hogwash today. I'm not sure why I'm using that phrase.
Well, Dillon and I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they repeat us, so we really have to be strategic with our words, and hogwash is one of those words that we can say.
Hogwash is one of those words, and I think that so many people throughout the centuries and the millennia, of human existence, people have always, stated that they have experienced some type of truth in their life, connection to family and friends and community and God, and so, just because that can't be tested doesn't mean it's not true.
Right. So I want to talk about the Enlightenment and how we got to truth becoming related to fact. But first I want to say, to really wrap up this word true and the definition of it, you could be true to God, but not true about God.
Oh.
I know. I've been working on that one.
Have you been working on that one?
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about how did this happen? How did truth become related to fact? The definition of truth began to shift with a period in time. It's actually this really crazy part of human history from only about 500 years ago that I don't think people talk nearly enough about, unless you're like me and you read all about this all the time. But I feel like we should be talking about it all the time in the regular world.
Yeah.
About 500 years ago, there was this crazy thing that happened where all of these things collided at the same time in history. The printing press was created, the Protestant Reformation, and the Age of Enlightenment, right? The scientific revolution. The Age of Enlightenment is the scientific revolution, right? Which brought about the scientific method. All these things happened in a very short period of time around the same time in history. And these things collided, impacted Christianity and our relationship to the Bible as we know it in a insurmountable way, in a way that I'm not sure we can ever disconnect from. And would you agree?
Oh, yeah.
Such a big way Christianity was shaped by these things. So the printing press came onto the scene around the year 1440, and this resulted in the spread of printed language. Again, I study language and culture, so the history of the printing press is really something, and I used to be a librarian as well. So books and printing press and language are my jam. I could do a whole, not even just a podcast episode, I could do a whole podcast just on what the printing press has done to us spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally, all these things. The invention of the printing press is paramount to AI and the internet right now, the digital revolution. Printing press was the same thing. It shifted everything about us.
Yeah, this is interesting. I just want to make this one little note especially about, so in the 14th and 15th century, not centuries, but the 14, 1500s, when the printing press became, foundational and very prevalent, and there started to be printed texts, books and other things which were readily accessible. It's so interesting because I think in our own tradition, in the Lutheran Church, So the way we worship is liturgical worship, and people will participate and follow along with a service bulletin. Or we have worship books. You can use the actual book, or you can use a printed service bulletin. And the joke among liturgical Protestants is, if you don't have a bulletin, nobody knows what they're doing, right? They have to have it in order to participate in worship, which is really, really interesting, because for much of Christianity, there was no printed service bulletin. There was no accessible even worship book. So when people came to church, when people came to worship, this is something that we have totally lost. They knew the prayers by heart. They felt them, they knew them, they remembered them, they memorized them. If you go to the Catholic Church, they don't give you a printed, at least most in the United States, even in other places, they don't give you a service bulletin because the people know it.
Yes.
I'm not saying one is better than the other, but what I'm saying is with printed things came reliance on, oh well, if it's not printed, I can't do it, I don't know it.
Yeah, it for sure shifted worship and the way we worship, but
it's not better or worse.
Right, we shouldn't romanticize it too much, because also before this time in history, people weren't hearing the Bible in their own language. They just had to trust that the priest was giving them the right stuff and interpreting it in as we now know, now that we all for 500 years have had the Bible in our hands, we see, wait a second, the Catholic Church has been saying that this text is really clear and this is what it means, but actually that can be read a lot of ways. That's not so clear to me, right? This interpretation thing is actually quite messy. So, and because people weren't hearing the biblical text, they couldn't read it because there was no printing press, and it cost a lot of money, or you needed to have an enslaved person to be a scribe for you to copy biblical text for you. So most people weren't reading it. If they were reading it, it wasn't in their own language, right?
Well, correct.
So it wasn't accessible. It wasn't translated into common languages yet, like German and then eventually English and all these other things. But also, it wasn't even being read to them in their language. They would go to church and they'd hear it read to them in like Latin, a language that not everybody even knew.
Oh, so, well, a majority of people didn't know it.
Right.
They had no idea. No, but what they
the priest would give a sermon in their language, but you're just trusting.
Oh, no, very rarely.
But some would.
Some would,
but even then, you're
rare.
just trusting.
The medieval church totally lost their way on giving sermons.
Okay, so you can see how we have opinions about the printing press. So back to the word truth. The printing press came onto the scene around the year 1440, and printed language everywhere, right? Bulletins, but also the Bible could be printed now, so people could read it. Obviously, this led to Martin Luther and all kinds of people, Wycliffe, all kinds of people were translating the Bible, so now people had the Bible in their own language and they could read it for the first time. This is the same time of the Protestant Reformation, right? So that's crazy. Like, we just talk about these things, but that actually is really important. The Protestant Reformation, whenever the Catholics, some people started breaking free and new ways of being a Christian started to form. I don't want to say breaking free. That sounds very Protestant heavy.
Because a lot of them actually, like I think of Luther,
there was a split in the church.
Yeah.
Protestantism became a thing. It started to take form.
And at
the same time, there was the printing press. So Bibles were starting to be in the hands of people for the first time, not just the religious elite.
And it's interesting because if you really, really hone in on Reformation history, its namesake is extremely important. It was a reform movement. It was a reformation. It was not a separation.
Right. Protestant has protest in it for a reason.
It was protesting something that was already there, an establishment. It was, in the very beginning, there was maybe some very, very minority groups that I learned about in seminary, and honestly I forget them because they were so small, but a minority of people said, yeah, we want to totally separate, and we don't want to be a part of this. But most of the reformers wanted to reform what was already there, the medieval Roman Catholic Church. They didn't want to leave it. They didn't want to separate themselves from it. That's unfortunately what ended up happening. But the idea of separating was not there. It was about reforming what was already in existence for millennia.
Yeah. So, I mean, really what we're trying to say is during this time, the printing press, Protestant Reformation, people began to read the Bible independently in their homes for the first time. That's the big thing in this context. But the other thing that was happening around this time in history is what has now been labeled as the Age of Enlightenment. This was an intellectual movement that began following the invention of the printing press and the Protestant Reformation. It took root around the 1600s, 1700s, depends on who you ask, but around that time, right? And this period is defined by rational thought, empirical evidence, which means like measurable evidence, and observable knowledge. And science, as we know it today, began with the Age of Enlightenment. And science influenced Christianity, especially Protestantism, which came out of this time in history. So science, again, this is all related to this concept of truth and fact. So science comes from the Latin word scire, which means literally to know. So science meant knowledge. And this thing really like swept over Western humanity especially. People started to think that the scientific method was the only way to construct knowledge or to know something to be factual. And this continued to expand in meaning since the Enlightenment, right? So science has really taken over everything.
And just a note here too, that at least I can't, because I'm not fully skilled in the Eastern Church, meaning Eastern Orthodoxy. But what we're talking about here is stuff that is going on, particularly in Western Europe and the United States and Canada and all these things, which is foundational, which are the two foundational traditions of Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. But in the Eastern world, in Asia and Africa, parts of Africa, and in the Middle East, where the Eastern Church is, where the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church is, they did not see this as much. The Enlightenment, rational theology did not take off in Eastern Christianity like it did with Western Christianity. So, like when we talk about Christianity, there's a whole other backside to the page that we can't even touch here on this podcast, because we would have to either bring somebody on or do some extensive research, because that's a whole tradition of the church that most Western Christians are unfamiliar with.
We could do an episode on Eastern Christianity. As we'd have to make sure people are aware we are outsiders looking in.
It's a very beautiful tradition, but it's
quite different from the Western
quite
version.
different.
Okay, so scientific thought quickly, they aligned themselves. I don't want to say they, because we're part of it too, but scientific thought quickly aligned itself against the teachings of the church and biblical texts for a lot of reasons. One reason is that religion was never meant to be viewed through a scientific worldview. Those are two different ways to construct knowledge, right? Those are two different things. Another reason, and this is a big one, is the Catholic Church refused to create space for the nuance that scientific discoveries were creating. The Catholic Church deemed so many scientific discoveries that seemed to contradict the church's doctrines as heretical, and even killed many people for it, right? And this caused a big problem in the beginning. This was really the beginning of division between science and religion that we continue to see today, right? So many atheists who are against religion, they also really are science fundamentalists, which we'll talk about. And we've talked about on another episode.
We've talked about that actually a lot.
Yeah. So many Christians will tell you that their love for science and religion do not contradict each other. We're humans. Humans are a paradox. We both resist paradox and we're made for paradox. Do you know what I mean? Like we hate it, but we're also made for it. I'll just say this really quickly. I don't know if you want to say more about it or just leave it at this. Dillon and I have absolutely no issues reconciling science and reason with faith and religion. That's not like a non-issue. I think you had to do some construction in your 20s.
Yeah, but I don't see them at odds with each other.
Right. It's not an issue.
And
there are so many Christians who don't. They've learned how to respect myth and religion and faith and sacred texts for what they are, and also science for what it is, and see the flaws in all of it, but also the meaning in all of it.
I mean, I believe that they are absolute parallels to each other, and parallels don't mean the same.
Well, the cliche analogy is different hands pointing to the same moon.
Sure, right, but yeah, I mean, and some would say they're asking the same questions, and I get where that might be helpful, but I actually think they're asking about, how do I want to say this? Science is asking why things happened. Why did the earth come into existence? All this, and religion is offering stories about, I don't even want to say who.
No.
Religion is offering stories of how we are to live within the mystery of the how and the why.
Yeah.
And so science is asking kind of how it happened and why it happened.
Well, and here's
religion is giving ritual, custom, culture, ethics, morals, shape to live within that. That doesn't mean that. Let me make it very clear on this podcast. That does not mean that I don't think that that God is the ground of all being and the creator of the world. I do believe that. But I I don't necessarily think that it has to be in a 24-hour day in 7 days.
Well, the beautiful thing, I'm thinking about like Neil deGrasse Tyson right now, and if you go follow his stuff on Instagram, he gets downright spiritual when he starts talking. It's wild, the things that he has to say. Wild. Like, just go follow some physicists and you'll see that, like, it just gets crazy. And what's beautiful about religion and science, but really all of it, whatever it is that you explore in the world, whatever it is, whether you're a fundraiser or whatever, exploration of this reality has no end. It all keeps going. I happen to be interested in language, and right now I'm interested in religious language. Every single time I think I'm going to reach the end of an inquiry, there is no end. It just keeps unfolding. And science is the same way. Anytime a scientist has a question about the universe and they go exploring, they don't find one answer, okay, I'm done. They find more questions. In fact, science is actually created this way. If you go read scientific papers, especially in the social sciences, I shouldn't talk about the hard sciences, but I think it's similar. At the end, you're going to find a section called a discussion or a conclusion. And then after that, you're going to find something usually called like further areas for research or further exploration. All scientific studies end with, here's what we need to do next, because there is no end to this exploration. Religion knows that, science knows it, the depth of it all is crazy. So back to the scientific method, this became a widely accepted way to know things. Again, this is why we started talking about what is knowledge in the beginning. So actually, science doesn't seek truth the way we defined it as like betrothed, right? This commitment. They don't even use the words truth. The words that the scientific paradigm uses, that the scientific community rather uses, they use the words reliability and validity. Something in science is reliable if the scientific method can be applied to it again and again and again and get the same results. And something is valid if it's actually testing what it claims to be testing. So the scientific community doesn't even say officially, this is true. They say it's valid and it's reliable. Or if you're like really deep in the weeds, they often say it's relativity. Oh my gosh.
Relativity?
Relatively.
That is a tongue twister.
Why does that sound weird coming out of my mouth? Relatively. It's relatively reliable. Or it's somewhat valid. It appears to be valid, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, there's just always this room for nuance. So, again, they're not testing truth. They're testing reliability and validity. So, I want to be super clear. We've kind of been circling the drain on this, but let's talk about it. Science, this was just my disclaimer. This was drilled into me in my doctorate. Drilled into me every single class, every single semester. For years, science and observation are not the only way or even the best way to know something. There's a lot of ways of knowing. Let's list as many as we can think of right now in just like a minute. So, my body knows things. My body knows things that my brain can't comprehend. My heart is beating. My brain is not telling my heart to beat. I don't have language for that, right? It's just knowing it and it's doing it. My body
knows, your brain is telling your heart to beat.
Right. I knew that you were going to go there. There's a connection. Okay, that's good. Let's back up.
I mean, I know what you were saying, but yes. I'm thinking of someone listening and they're thinking, what? I know what you're saying.
Okay, so let's back up. Let's back up quick.
Okay.
So even this dichotomy, whenever we say mind and body, our brain is our body. So, and it's hard for me not to speak that way because that's how our culture speaks about it, but...
Although the ancient people did not always see it that way.
Right, that's a very long, complicated history,
too.
But our brain and our body are not separate. There's it's all connected. It's all the same thing. You know what I mean? But my body knows because it tells me somewhere beyond language, right? And beyond reason and even logic. My body, sometimes I wake up and I feel this buzzing energy that like pulls me towards projects. Like I should sit down and write. I'm in the mood to write, right? That's knowledge, but I didn't have to do the scientific method to arrive there. Or sometimes before I'm really, really sick, my body kind of slows down, right? That's knowledge. Our body is telling us, hey, you're tired, sit down and rest because you're about to fight something. I don't even like the word fight, but you're about to get rid of a virus, so you need to rest, so I'm going to make it so you can't get up.
Well, yeah, I think about...
that's knowledge, you know?
Some, if not many, Christians sometimes tend to... They either love Paul, or Paul meaning Saul, who became Paul, Saint Paul, however you want to refer to him in the New Testament, who has many letters and writings, both from himself and then some from his followers. He talks a lot about the body, and about the body of Christ, about the church, and this living, breathing reality of the church, which is like a body. And in some of his letters, he'll talk about the arms, and he'll talk about the legs, and he'll talk about the head, and he'll talk about the voice, and he'll talk about all these things. And he says basically not only individually but collectively, when one isn't working, that can stop other things, and it can hinder other things. So everything, what Paul's trying to say is, it's about the holisticness of the whole created being. Right. It is about the whole body, which is also connected with the soul or the spirit, however you want to think about that lives within us, with us. Right. And also that gives a connection to how we are connected to other people. And so what we have done, though, is we've
made knowledge only part of the brain.
Well, only a part of the brain, and we've separated it all.
And if this sounds... we've separated it.
Oh, we totally... I mean, I think about like...
To analyze means to take apart. And listen, I am a master analyzer. It's all I do all day is tear things apart so I can understand them. But analyze means to take apart. Synthesize means to bring back together. And we are very much in a culture of analyze. Take it all apart. Take it all apart. And there are some benefits to that. But my whole point is, if this sounds crazy wacky to you, just know that we are very much in a point in our culture and history where we're all brain, all reason, all logic, but that's not the only way to know things. Emotions are knowledge, right? The earth knows things. Prayer is a way to sink into an awareness, to know things that cannot be seen or measured.
And prayer, so talking about the truth of prayer, mm-hmm. I'm not talking about fact. I'm talking about truth.
The commitment to the relationship.
Whether it's individual prayer, or it's collective prayer, praying in a group or a community, prayer And some people talk about the power of prayer, which sometimes grinds my gears because of how people talk about that. But there is a power to prayer, whether it's individual or it's collective. And that power of prayer, again, whether individual or collective, is something that can be true in that you experience it and you feel it.
And you sometimes are changed by it.
You are changed by it. You're transformed by it. You're renewed by it. Your sorrow as you enter can sometimes, in the conclusion of it, come to a joy or a moment of uplift of being uplifted.
Right.
And
again, prayer is a way of knowing something. It sinks you into this awareness. This is all very difficult to talk about. It's like things that exist beyond language. But science is not the only way to know something, is our whole point. There's so many ways to know things. And truth, again, is less about knowing and more about commitment. But Christians were up against... Go ahead.
I don't want to get off on a bunny trail here, but I want to say something, and this might shock many people, especially because, remember, I'm a pastor.
Is this about truth?
Yes. Mm-hmm. The truth of prayer is not about what the outcome is. It's about what is being experienced during the time to which you're doing it. That doesn't mean that the outcome doesn't matter, but if you're only praying and thinking about the outcome, you're missing the wholeness of prayer and the truth that comes from prayer. The truth that comes from prayer is that while you're in prayer, you are experiencing the truth of comfort, of compassion, of sorrow turning to joy, and in hopes that, yes, there will be a good outcome. And yet, if it's only the outcome, you're missing it. You're missing the fullness of that truth.
It feels...
People say, well...
Prayer feels to me like a dropping into an awareness. For example...
Well, sometimes people will pray too, and they want it becomes something transactional.
Right. Well, I think about being a mother. I think you're the same way. I honestly could go all day just almost on like autopilot with our children because we have so much to do. We have to get them ready and feed them. And Dillon and I, like today, we're both working from home. I'm working from home, so we're getting work done and they're napping. And if I stop for a moment and look at their faces, it feels like prayer to me because I'm sinking in to a deeper awareness that helps me know something that I've just been sliding down the surface of before, right? It had nothing to do with I shouldn't say nothing, but it's not about my brain. It's not about science. It's just about sinking into an awareness. And then you know things. I'm reminded that like, oh my gosh, I love this person. That's why I'm feeding them and all these things. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I feel like we're getting really wacky with this one if you're not used to talking about like other ways of knowing. But Christians, all this is to say that Christians were up against the rise of a scientific worldview. So they said, essentially, during the scientific revolution, right, the Enlightenment, essentially a lot of Christians were saying, hey, we have fact over here too. We know things over here too. And this is when truth and fact really began to merge. Church leaders wanted to stay relevant. So what did they do? The Bible began to be read as a 100% factual text, and God began to be explored as something provable and measurable. God was discussed that way. I'm generalizing here. There are some traditions that didn't do that, some that did it temporarily. A lot of us are coming out of it now, but people still will read the Bible as this always literal, factual, scientific text that proves things to be true or factual rather, right? And of course, religion exists in a realm beyond science. In fact, science is so new. We can't read a text that was written down before science and the scientific method even became a thing. You know what I mean?
Right, and it's interesting because simultaneously, in a parallel to when this was coming into being, this rationalism, this logical way of thinking, which will end up into fundamentalism, as we'll talk. A parallel to that, or a resistance to that, which you slightly mentioned, is that this is when biblical studies and biblical criticism really became a thing.
Yeah.
In that people started to, on the other side, say, oh, no, wait, hold up here. You're taking these words on a paper and not doing any type of learning about the history, the culture, the language, the religion of the time, and understanding where these were coming from, how those people believed it. And so that's when you get biblical studies and people going actually back to the original languages of the Hebrew, the Greek, the Aramaic.
Right. Can we actually pause there for a minute? Because you made a really good point. A counter...
Yeah, that would be a way to say it.
A counter response, that's redundant, but a response to science, a Christian response to science was, hey, look over here, our Bible is factual. And then a response to that way of being a Christian was, wait a second, it's not all factual. There are some things that are verifiable and there are some things that are factual, but there actually is a lot of stuff in the Bible that is a poem, that is metaphor, and which I think is a beautiful thing. It tends to be where Christianity is right now. We're still unpacking all that, but also translation, which is what I'm obsessed with. 500 years ago, the Bible was finally translated into a language besides Hebrew, Greek, Latin. We've got German, every language pretty much, right? It's all over the place. Even in English, there are hundreds and hundreds of translations just in the English language.
Right, like I think about our own tradition, the Lutheran tradition. The Lutheran tradition in its modern form, and when I'm talking about modern form, I'm talking about in the last 250 to 300 years, in both Europe and the United States. If you go to an ELCA church, an ELCA Lutheran church, or any other mainline Protestant denomination, those pastors are going to be trained in what is called biblical criticism, which is a specific way of interpreting the religious texts that's looking at all facets of how those texts came into being, who their authors are, who their authors are not.
I heard it said this way once: if it never meant it, it can't mean it now.
Right. And looking at, really digging in deep to understanding the historicity of the biblical texts, and which brought about biblical studies. That's how you get things like, people literally found out that when you go back to the earliest Hebrew and some of the manuscripts that we have, it doesn't say the Red Sea, it says the Reed Sea. And these things, these criticisms, not criticisms of the Bible, but criticisms in analysis of the Bible, actually gets you closer to what the truth would have been at that very time. And so when you analyze the text, sometimes criticism sounds like people, well, you're criticizing the Bible. No, you're analyzing it. And when you analyze it, you actually find deeper truths.
And Richard Rohr says, that which can't be criticized becomes evil.
Oh, that's
so
good.
So if we can't criticize the Bible, it will become evil. If we can't criticize a president, they will become evil. If we can't criticize a nation, it will become evil. If you can't handle respectful criticism of yourself, there's probably some evil in there to hash out.
And also, if you are just saying, well, this is what the Bible says, then you're missing the point. I'm going to get in trouble for saying this. If you are a person, or you're around people that says, well, this is what the Bible says, and that's it, and that's final, please get away from them. Please be gentle and loving to them, but get away from them, because that has never been the case. Mm-hmm. And it is when you read the text and study the history and the language and the culture and the religion of that time that the truth of the scriptures, and I mean that with a capital T, the truth of the scriptures become even more true.
That's so good. I'm really intentional about not saying the Bible clearly says blah, 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 unless I really mean it. There are some things that I believe are clear, but not many. And that it's not usually specific verses where I'm like, this clearly means. But I'm in the editing stages of my book, And my editor, just a couple of days ago, I read a comment that she left on my document, and I said, it clearly states blah, 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 blah. And she commented and said, I think that we should avoid using this word because in my experience, just what you said, saying the Bible clearly states something is not usually true. If it was clear, we wouldn't be arguing about it. Okay, so that's good. I like the bunny trails.
One more bunny trail.
Okay.
I know we're at 49 minutes.
And now we're going to talk about fundamentalism quickly.
Okay.
I don't have that much left.
I know we're on a bunny trail, but I'm forgetting chapter and verse, and honestly, those things are modern too. So, it honestly doesn't really matter chapter and verse. But there is a passage in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, from the prophet Malachi, and I believe it's Malachi. I'm saying that, and no, it's not Malachi. It's Nehemiah. Thank you. It's Nehemiah, and Nehemiah talks about when you read the text, meaning when you read the scriptures, they are to be interpreted for the day and the people. And so this idea that, well, it says this in the text, and you just need to read it, and that's it, and final. That has never been the only way of doing it. And many of the Old Testament prophets, had been given a word by the Spirit of God to be interpreted and given to the people of the day. And those texts and writings and things are to be interpreted and kind of gnawed on and looked at. So even the idea of interpretation of texts and understandings and teachings and morals and ethics have always been there. They're in the Jewish tradition, they're there in the Christian tradition, and they've always been there.
That's good. Well, I don't think we've said this yet before we dive into fundamentalism and how this understanding of like the Bible through a scientific lens has created fundamentalism. Not created, but really amped up fundamentalism. Truth is, if you think about the tortoise and the hare, right? There's a turtle and there's a rabbit and they're racing, and the rabbit keeps getting distracted and the turtle ends up winning, and the moral of the story is slow and steady wins the race, right? That is not a factual story, but there's truth in that story.
Oh, there's so much truth.
So a lot of times whenever Christians or religious people are using those words really intentionally, capital T truth, right, is like divine godly truths. It's not factual. Like there wasn't an actual turtle and rabbit who raced, right? And the rabbit kept getting distracted, blah, blah. No, but there's truth in that. And that's how, now there's also some fact in the Bible. I don't want to deny that either. There are some things that are factual. Some of them can be proven to be true. Some of them can't. We're still exploring it. There are probably many things that we don't believe are factual that maybe in a couple hundred years we'll learn like, oh wow, that actually was a fact. Who knows? But some of it's just lost to history now. But there is a difference between fact and true, even the way we relate to it now in different contexts.
Fact versus truth is very powerful in the teachings of Jesus, which we see in all four Gospels, which come out of the parable tradition.
Right.
There is no historical fact to parables, but there is truth to their meaning for people's lives and how they change them. So just like the tortoise and the hare, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the sower,
the prodigal son.
There
wasn't actually one son who left and came back, and Jesus wasn't trying to tell people like, hey, there's a son who left and he came back, and there was a banquet for him because the dad was so happy. That's not the point. That wasn't a factual story. It was a story Jesus was telling to make a point, to make of truth.
Of a truth that many of us witness in our own lives.
A truth to be loyal to, which is, when you stray, God will welcome you home and celebrate you, not punish you when you come back. That's a truth from that story, right? It's a truth to be committed to, loyal to. Okay, fundamentalism. For me, fundamentalism is any worldview that thinks its perspective on reality is the only possible perspective. Fundamentalism has a complete refusal to embrace this mystery of this absolutely bonkers reality that we are all part of here. And fundamentalism claims to have only answers and no questions.
Preach it.
Fundamentalism cannot stand to be questioned or critiqued. And I can say this with some authority because I do not like to be questioned.
Really? You of all people.
What I hate is whenever, well, let's just dive into it for a moment, because I have a little bit of fundamentalism in me.
We all do.
Right.
We all do.
Sure.
Even for our viewing listeners, whether you like it or not, we all do.
Mm-hmm. Fundamental, it's not specific to religion either, right? In the scientific community, they can be as much fundamentalist as the religious. So for me, well, it doesn't matter. Just know that I don't like to be questioned, and I'm working on it. There is no part of my life, as Dillon can attest to, I think, that is not heavily examined and analyzed to the point of exhaustion. I can't help it. It's the way I'm wired. It's who I am. I've surrendered. That means, for example, some like biblical words that I have spent years and years and years researching and learning about and taking notes on and writing in books about, and then I have a book coming out about it. And if somebody questions me about one of those things, and again, not like curiosity, but like tells me I'm wrong, and when they have done zero exploration, I get fundamentalist about it. I don't like that, of like, you have put in no effort. Like somebody who is just like kind of your average atheist who's like, oh, I think that all this stuff is crap, and they try to engage in a conversation, but they actually don't even care enough to even read a book, but they want to fight you like it's their world's effort. Do you know what I mean? Anyway.
Unfortunately.
Anyway, I don't like to be questioned in that way. Side note. So, fundamentalists, what I'm saying is I'm coming at this from a certain sense of humility because I get it. We all have certain things we think we're right about. Especially me. But what's interesting about Christian fundamentalists in this context, talking about truth, is many of them claim to reject much of science, most notably favoring creationism over evolution, right? They tend to reject a lot of the scientific reason that has been on the rise since the age of the Enlightenment. However, Christian fundamentalists are a direct byproduct of the Enlightenment. They are the first Christians to read the Bible as a factual and scientific text rather than a truthful and ancient sacred text. And they are rejecting science, but still using a scientific framework for their Christianity. Does that make sense the way I'm explaining it?
Yeah, I don't know if...
Am I speaking in absolutes maybe too much?
Well, no, not necessarily. I know where you're coming from. I wouldn't say that they were the first ones to read it that way.
Okay, explain it a little better.
Oh, no, I think you explained it well. She's being questioned. No.
No, can I clear up my being questioned thing? I feel like some people who listen to this and know me are going to be afraid to talk.
Oh, my word.
I am fine with a healthy discussion. I mean, I don't like being questioned when somebody who doesn't even know what they're talking about has these really strong opinions with somebody who does know what they're talking about. I tend to really struggle with that.
That makes total sense, and you're a lovable person. Okay. Please.
I'm not question me and I'll hate you.
So the ancient people, it's important. This is why every single time I go back, this was nailed into me. I shouldn't use that phrase, but it was nailed into me in grad school and seminary that this is why there is an importance of, I can't say all these things more, the history, the culture, the language, the religion, the way of being for the ancient people when reading an ancient text matters, especially when you're reading it in modern times. And when these texts were written, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, there was no such thing as modern science. I mean, if you read the story in Matthew's Gospel about the Magi coming, we did a whole episode on this. The idea of a priest also being a person who studies astrology and astronomy and the stars, and priests were also mathematicians, and they were also swinging incense and doing sacrifices. I mean, it was all mixed together. So this idea of the separation between science and the separation of religion wasn't even a thing. It wasn't even on these people's radar. They were mixing myth with finding where the stars were, and they were, again, swinging incense and doing sacrifices while they were also, helping, pray and build pyramids. Everything was mixed together. And so now we don't see the world like that. We have separated it, for better or for worse. So they were reading these things much more nuanced than we are, because it all was mixed together. And now,
because we became a society really obsessed with science, beautiful, science has brought us great things, but then we started to think that everything can be looked at as a scientific inquiry.
Right. Does that make sense what I was saying, though? I mean, the ancient people would have never read those texts
in that literal scientific way,
because
even
and religion and science weren't separated like they are today.
Right.
And so that's all I was saying about like the first. It would make sense that like the first, like, you know what I'm trying to say? I think.
So you're saying fundamentalists were not the first to read this in a scientific way?
Right.
Who were?
I would think. I mean, people's understanding that because there was very limited evidential materialism science going on at that time. Like, I think about the ancient...
Wait. No, I'm saying I'm confused. I'm saying fundamentalists were the first to read it in this literal scientific way, but you're saying that there's a group that you believe who read it before fundamentalists in this literal way.
I'm not saying in a fundamentalist way, but what I am saying is religion and what we would now see as science were commingled. They were together. So the idea that you would read about the creation of the world or the end of the world or something like that,
I see.
Was
I see.
They understood the world to be like that, right. But they weren't so fundamental about it to say, well, this is right and that's wrong.
I get what you're saying.
Nuance.
There's nuance. So what we're doing is the only thing you can do with language. Language and...
That makes sense?
Yes. Tell me if I'm getting at what you're saying. I don't even think our listeners are going to follow us, but that's all right. Half the reason we do this is because you and I enjoy it. So, language is a categorical system. Language can only categorize. So whenever we say science was created during the Enlightenment, right? It came out of the Enlightenment. We are categorizing, but the truth is rationality existed before this.
Right. I mean, like, people
So you're saying people read these texts with a rational lens before, just not to this degree.
I think of ancient Babylon and Sumer. I mean, that's where you get algebra and you get you get all these math that people were building. Yes. So there was science, but the science wasn't like opposed to also myths about creation or myths about the coming of the end of the world.
The lines are blurred. That's because religion isn't part of history. Religion is history.
Oh,
you can't separate it. Like, you can't explore human history without religion, and it's not like religion is part of it. It's all of it. It is it. So, yeah, I get what you're saying.
And I get what you're saying.
It wasn't like science came out of nowhere 500 years ago, but the scientific method, it became formalized.
And reading it...
in our lineage, in our Western culture.
Right, and reading it the way that we now read it.
Right.
That is new.
Yes. So, fundamentalists, and again, fundamentalists even, I don't know anybody who would say, yeah, I'm a fundamentalist. Fundamentalists are like a thing that the outsider labels somebody as, but nobody claims that. There's not like a formal fundamentalist church. Do you know what I mean? So even that category is nuanced. Thoughts?
I'm just getting heart palpitations thinking about fundamentalists, but yeah.
So, this way of relating to Christianity and the Bible, though, is just like bringing science to it in this heavy-handed way. At this point in history, it resulted in some crazy things from our point of view in Christianity. So there's Bishop James Ussher. Am I saying his last name right? Mm-hmm. Ussher. He was the church.
Not the singer.
Not the singer. Two S's. He was the Church of Ireland Archbishop in the 1600s. Fancy.
Which is part of the Anglican Church.
Yes, and he really. So the 1600s. Remember, all this was going on in history that we've been talking about. He calculated the age of the universe by totaling the ages of the patriarchs in the Bible, concluding that creation began in 3963 BCE. So about 6,000 years ago. This is why some fundamentalist Christians still believe the world is only 6,000 years old. And his efforts to apply this scientific thought and measurement and rationality to the Bible, this is what he came up with. And fundamentalism did not begin with him, but his actions are one of the first traces of evidence of what came to be known as fundamentalism a few centuries later.
And do you know that the Church of England has come out and apologized for his behavior?
Good.
Officially.
Good.
Like 60 years ago. But
this way of thinking has done a lot of damage.
Oh, I feel like, unfortunately, Bishop Usher, God rest his soul, but it was an embarrassment to the Church of England.
Sure.
And so they have come out and publicly, first off denounce. It's called like a statement or something. You can find it. You can look it up. It's quite illuminating for a nerd like us. Nerds.
Well, this is just an example I wanted to bring up because the Bible they didn't even think of recorded history in the same way. Again, remember, all Bible stories were told out loud for a long time before they were even written down, right? And recorded history being 100% accurate, not only was it not a complete value, it wasn't like the most important thing for them, but also scribes would go back, and we have evidence of this. Scribes, there's evidence that they would change some of the dating in the Bible to make it match and mesh up with the rest of the story. We see it crossed out, erased, smudged, not erased, but like smudged out, crossed out, written in the margins. So we know that the Bible has been changed by some people just to kind of smooth over.
But but not to you and I, and not to many people. But that for many people is one of the reasons why they said, I'm going to go with hogwash again because I like that. The Bible is a bunch of hogwash. How could you ever find any truth in something that has been changed over time? How can you even trust that any of this is true?
And I think that's valid, but those same people would turn to science like it's not flawed, and science does the same thing. Go look at some scientific articles. Anyone that's worth anything, that's in a really hotly debated thing, it will say like originally published in 2010, edited in 2012, edited again in 2014.
Totally.
Revisions made to paragraph 3 on page 17 in 2016, because they're constantly editing and revising based on later findings.
And not my way of understanding the scriptures, but that is a common comment of,
I think it's even valid.
Then I can't even trust it. Well,
I think that's a fundamentalist view to take, though. For me, that's what makes it fun, is this, like, the Bible's not just something that, first of all, reading it the whole way through once is an accomplishment in itself, but it's not just something you read and you're like, oh, cool, I read that, now I'm done. It's something you trust in, meaning relate to over and over and over again. It's something that you can wrestle with. Israel means to wrestle with God, by the way. So God's people, Israel, are called to wrestle with.
And something that you have to be dedicated to. And this is a slightly light joke, but if you can get through 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Numbers and get through all the genealogies.
No, if you can get through Genesis.
Well, okay, if you can get through Genesis, but you'll be all right. You'll be all right. You'll be all right. You won't understand it, but you'll be okay.
So we talked about truth versus fact and the Enlightenment and the history and the Protestant Revolution and the Bible and the printing press. We talked about fundamentalism and how reading the Bible through the scientific lens as for like fact is different than truth. But I do want to just say two more short things. So I told Dillon this the other day, and I hope it makes sense. I don't know if it's going to make sense to everybody, but we all think that we own the truth and that we know it. We've stumbled upon it. But really, it's just perspective. It doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it one way. If we had the whole truth, we'd be God, right? So let's just start there. And I think about movies. A side character in a movie who's like mean to somebody in line at the grocery store, they're a jerk, right? It's really easy for us to look at this side character, this like, is that what they're called? Side character, minor character?
I don't know if they're called side character.
Like a minor character,
Maybe.
like, oh, that person's a jerk. They're so mean, right? But the power of movies is if you just take the camera and turn that person into the main character, suddenly we're rooting for them. And suddenly we have an understanding of why they're being a jerk that day.
Or we're giving an explanation of, well, like maybe they got bad news, or
right,
like
right. So if you just sometimes we all know some people like this. Do you know some people who? We have a friend who used this language. She said she describes somebody as main character energy. You know how some people just have main character energy? Like if you're at a meeting at work or at church or family maybe, there's always somebody who has main character energy. They think the camera's on them, and they think that everybody else's lens is on them too. They think that their issues are the biggest concern. I think people know what I mean when I say main character energy, right? We all know people like that.
We all know a main character.
And we are the main character of our story. I get that. But sometimes we need to shift the camera a little bit, and we can see that we don't own the truth. We actually we have one lens on the truth. But if we could widen it, or even narrow it and like turn the lens on someone else, make a side character the main character for a day, somebody that you really don't like, try to like really listen to them and see, like somebody who doesn't agree with you about this reality and what's going on here, whether it's politically or religiously. It doesn't take long, right? I actually don't have tolerance for people who, I was going to get political, but I don't feel like it now we're in. People who vote for somebody differently than you, if you focus your attention on them just for a day or two, you can humanize them very quickly. It doesn't take much time. They're a human, and they're not bad. We're all contributing to systems in dangerous ways, so let's all be careful with who we turn into the enemy. Otherwise, we're just the same of the old thing that we're trying to change, right? Okay, just a little bit more. I want to get through all my notes because I like this topic. The Enlightenment really created new expectations of language. That's the part I'm really interested in. So language became a way to communicate accuracy and facts around this time. Language became, and I feel this in my classes that I teach so much, language became linear, direct, and simple. And poetic literacy began to decline and almost went out the door, right? People lost their ability to understand, but also appreciation for symbolism, metaphor, analogy, right? We see this, listen, where we live, we were recently shown a picture of a place in our town that has a swastika, and the person genuinely couldn't understand why a swastika flag was a problem. That is a lack of symbolic literacy. And to think that a symbol doesn't have meaning, we've lost that. But biblical societies, they had a deep, entrenched understanding of symbolism, deeply.
Yeah, what's interesting? So I think on this podcast, we always humorously, but also in a deep reality, make fun of the King James Bible, or
which is 1611, this time in history,
which would be known as like Elizabethan language during the time of Queen Elizabeth I and beyond. And what's really interesting, though, in most churches, even including ours, when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we are praying the Lord's Prayer according to the King James Bible. And many people would say, when it comes to like language and understanding language and hearing language and speaking language, that those type of the King James version of the Bible, also the King James version or the Elizabethan version of liturgy, of worship books, is very easy for people to memorize and understand. With the these and the thous and the those, it's very poetic. It's very, very high language, and so it's easy to understand. There's a modern version of. When I say modern, it's using modern language, but it's actually closer to what the Lord's Prayer is in the original text of the Greek. But most people don't even use it because they're so used to using the language of the King James Version. For thou is the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours now and forever. Amen. Our Father who art in heaven.
Thou shalt not kill.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't talk like that.
So we don't talk like that, but it is very rhythmically, linguistically, not edifying. Well, for some people it might be edifying.
I'll tell you what it is socially. It reminds us of a time that we romanticize. This is truly what it is. A lot of scholars who study race have done this. It reminds us of a time whenever enslavement was allowed, when white people were on top, whenever men were in charge. We romanticize that time in history, and that old English language reminds us of that time. We romanticize it.
Yes.
That is one aspect of it.
Yeah, I'm going to not push back, but yes. Okay.
You're going to question me?
No. No. That is indeed the academic truth of it, the academic reality of it, which is indeed also historically true. And yet, I would argue, people who have been brought up in the past 50, 60, 70 years, when they pray the Lord's Prayer with the thous and the arts and the these, they're not thinking of a time of enslavement. And that's just what they were taught. That's just what they know. So that which comes from that time. But they're not thinking of that or romanticizing that which time it came from. They were thinking of, that's how I was taught as a little kid, and that's all I know.
Yeah, it's more nuanced. I'm not saying every individual,
but
socially.
But what we were taught as a little kid comes from a time which was deeply not inclusive and deeply problematic in many ways.
Yeah, but I'm talking systemically. Individuals probably aren't like, oh, yes, I want the King James Version because it reminds me of a time during colonialism whenever white people had power and blah, blah, blah. That's not what they're thinking.
No, I know.
But systemically, there's a reason why when you go to Barnes & Noble, it's the King James Version that's everywhere. Systemically, there's a reason why that specific English language and dialect has been preserved more than any other dialect of Bible, and there are countless of them. But go to any bookstore and you'll see it's King James Version everywhere.
Well, I just would like to
systems have backed that version more than others.
I just want to remind our viewing audience, our listening audience, that is the version of the Bible that Jesus read.
Created in 1611. The words Christianity and Christology, am I saying that right? Christology?
Christology.
Christology. There's an E at Christology? Christology. No, Christology. Okay, so Christianity ends in the suffix ity, which means the condition or state of or experience of. So Christianity is to experience it, right? Christology ends in the suffix ology, which means the study of or the science of. So if you're interested in Christology, which I would argue is maybe what you and I are doing sometimes, there's some overlap. But,
I had to do a lot
Christianity is not about the knowledge of Christ. It's about the experience of Christ. And there's a difference, right? Again, truth is about the experience and the commitment to this thing called Christianity, not about proving its factuality, right? So, go ahead.
No.
All I have to say is truth is about being in relationship, not about rationality. And if that sounds really weird to you, this is how love works too, by the way. I kind of touched on this, but it's abstract. So if you ask me why I love Dillon or our daughters so much, it's not rational. Right? It's not rational at all.
It's even pre and post verbal.
Yeah, I say that a lot. It's pre and post verbal. Language can't touch it. That sounds romantic, but I'm about to get a little brutal here. So I'll talk about being a mother. There is no rational reason why Dillon and I would wake up every stinking day and devote the first 2 hours of our day to chasing our screaming children through our house to get them dressed, and they take their shoes off, we have to put their shoes back on, wear your socks, make you a hot breakfast that they probably won't even eat, or they'll throw and be like, ooh, I don't like this. Deal with their really loud noises, their really big emotions, their tantrums. Right?
Not to cut you off, but I made really, really good, nice, crispy home fries this morning, which were unbelievably delicious. What did our girls say about them?
I don't like this.
I don't like that.
I don't like this.
You know what though? You know what though? I was glad to make it for them.
Right. It's not rational.
I was glad to make it for them.
It's not rational. Why would we do that? Why? A rational person would not do that. We would not spend our money on our children. We would not spend our weekends with our children. We go travel all of the time or do something else. But we don't, because we love our children, and it's not rational. It doesn't make logical sense. Why? For whatever mysterious reason, are we committed, right? Truth is about commitment. Why is it true that we will spend the next 15 years or so waking up, making sure our children have everything they need, figuring out how to afford to give them lunch money, all of these things. And we can even talk about that in the context of a spouse as well. It's equally as inconvenient.
Well, sure, yeah.
Right? It's not rational. Right. And yet we do it, and we want to. I don't even want to say we want to, because sometimes we don't, but we're committed to it. We are committed. It's beyond rationality, and it enters the realm of relationship. And that is what we're talking about when we talk about fact versus truth. Fact is about rationality and what can be proven and observed. And relationship is not rational. It can't be observed. You can barely even talk about it because it makes no freaking sense. Try, again, I'm talking about parenting. If you're not a parent, this might not make sense. But try, I have friends who, if maybe they want kids in the future, it is very difficult for me to tell them the truth about motherhood. Because the fact of it is, don't do it. Your life will never be the same. Your body will never be the same. Your time is not your own anymore. Everything that you thought you knew is over. And it's so amazing and it's so wonderful. It's so fulfilling. I would do it over and over and over again.
Right, you wake up.
It's strange. It's very strange because we've entered a world beyond rationality. And that's what religion is as well. That's what capital L, love, God, Jesus Christ, all of it. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about this thing beyond rationality and science. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. So there's no way to prove it. That's above my pay grade. The end. Anything else you have to add?
Just that, as we remind you each week, stay curious.
Stay curious. And committed to the truth.
Ooh.
To understand